Good evening, dear ladies and gentlemen. Warmly welcome to the Diplomatic Academy. My name is Michael Zinkanell. I'm the director of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here to this very interesting and timely discussion that we have planned for today. Our first edition of our series, Transatlantic Talks. We'll be speaking today about the European security and defense policy, and especially the future of the transatlantic relation vis-a-vis the NATO-EU relation. And before I start introducing our two excellent speakers for tonight, please welcome together with me David Kirsch, who is our partner for this event series. David Kirsch, please take the floor for your introductory remarks, and thank you very much to the Young Transatlantic Initiative also for co-hosting the event tonight together with us.
Thank you, Michael. Good evening from my side. My name is David Kirsch. I'm the head of the City Hub of the Young Transatlantic Initiative in Vienna. It's a pleasure to welcome you for this first session of the Transatlantic Talks. And today, as we dive into European security, I would love to also consider the wider implications of the upcoming elections in the United States. As Young Transatlantic Initiative, we are an initiative that originated in Germany but has since expanded to Austria, dedicated to educating young people about the importance of close cooperation with our transatlantic partners. And we have been committed to promoting European North American cultural understanding and societal dialogue about the future of the transatlantic partnership. And our activities bring together societies from Austria, from Germany, but also from the United States, from Canada, and from Mexico. And for Austria, and indeed for young people, these US elections are critical because they shape policies that influence global security, economic ties, environmental standards, all of which directly impact our lives. And as we navigate these significant geopolitical shifts, the outcomes will also determine the strategic decisions and relationships within our own continent, particularly our alliances through NATO. And these close cooperations between the US and Europe holds immense value for our youth, and it fosters collaboration and dismantling of prejudice, enriching both our cultures and societies. And I would like to extend our gratitude to all our cooperation partners, IES, IATA, and particularly the Diplomatic Academy, whose hall we are privileged to reside in today. Their support makes events like this possible and deeply enriches our discussions. Let us remain committed to understanding and engaging in these transatlantic dynamics. Our involvement is crucial, not only to adapt to changes, but to actively shape the world we aspire to live in. I wish us an engaging evening, and now I have the pleasure to hand over to Michael Zinkanell. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, from the Young Transatlantic Initiative. Thanks also to the Young Atlantic Treaty Association, together with the Diplomatic Academy and the AIS to host this event tonight. I didn't track the time, but I think it took us roughly 60 seconds to mention the implications of the US elections against the background of today's discussion. So the elephant in the room is already openly mentioned. This will certainly be a very relevant question that we can address tonight, what the implications might be. However, of course, also with regards to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the transatlantic relations have shifted dramatically and have increased dramatically also in importance with the whole Zeitenwende effect that we have also, as the AIS discussed quite openly and quite vividly over the last couple of months, the implications and the aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine to European security, but also, of course, to Austrian security, has had major implications. And therefore, for stakeholders, for policymakers, for security experts in Europe, it has become quite obviously clear, quite undoubtedly clear that NATO is the safeguarding center of European security and stability. So against this background of very challenging times, I'd like to discuss tonight the outlook of the future perspectives of the transatlantic relationship based on the analysis of the current affairs, what we can at least see in perspective to the foreseeable future in the transatlantic relation. As David already mentioned, it will be decisive also for the future of the young generation in Europe. And of course, we also have this year quite an anniversary, 75 years NATO, but also a historic year when it comes to both the US elections, the European elections aligning with one another, and just today, the first state visit of President Macron, the first state visit of a French president to Germany in the last, 24 years, if I remember correctly, to probably warm up the frosty ties also between Germany and France. And here we can probably discuss a little bit further also what that might mean for the transatlantic relations, how the inner European relations between Germany, France, probably also taking a look at Poland, where Stanley, you just came from, would be quite relevant against this backdrop. So with no further ado, allow me to introduce our two speakers for tonight. To my right is Stanley Sloan, expert on transatlantic relations with more than 20 years experience. Since the 1990s, Stanley Sloan has lectured more than 70 times at the NATO College in Rome. He is a visiting scholar in political science at the Middlebury College and non-resident senior fellow at the Center of the Atlantic Council in the US, and also what we are of course very proud of, senior associate and senior advisor at the AIS. Stanley, thank you very much for being with us tonight. To my left, Alena Kudzko. Alena, you came all the way from beautiful Bratislava to us today. You've just been with us end of last year during our last AIS European Forum, our annual flagship event. Alena is the Vice President for Policy and Programming at Globsec in Bratislava, and she is focusing in her research on European transatlantic relations, especially with regards to security and defense. And at Globsec, you're overseeing policy development, research in the areas of defense and security and the future of Europe, and of course global order, where the transatlantic relations between the European Union in particular and NATO must not be forgotten. I would like to start, Stanley, with you and invite you to give us your introductory remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks to the Institute for organizing this session today. It's great to be back in Vienna. I haven't been here for a few years. And if I think back to the original reason for coming to Vienna, it was in 1973. The numbers that Michael mentioned are a little bit understated. I've been working on European security for, I don't want to even say the number, it's so big. But in any case, I came to Vienna to serve on the US delegation to mutual and balanced force reduction negotiations in 1973. And of course, the West called them balanced, put in the word balanced in the title of the talks because the position from the NATO countries was that the Warsaw Pact would have to withdraw many more forces than would NATO to reach a balanced outcome. And of course, Moscow disagreed with this fairly strongly, so the talks fell into deadlock for a long time. And after I returned to Washington, I eventually went to the Congressional Research Service and started working there, and I was asked by the House Committee on Foreign Affairs to write a report on how these negotiations could get out of deadlock, because they were in deadlock for several years, based mainly on this disagreement about how many forces the two sides had in the reduction zone. And I wrote a study, which was published by the House Foreign Affairs Committee, which suggested, as a congressional research person, I wasn't supposed to be an advocate, but the committee asked me to come up with an idea. So I produced an idea. I suggested not fighting about how many troops were there now, but instead agreeing on how many would be on each side at the end of the negotiations after reductions were made, and incorporate that kind of an agreement with very serious inspection measures and confidence building measures and so forth. And ironically, that idea, through a variety of ways, got through to the people advising Margaret Thatcher and Chancellor Kohl, and they got in touch with Ronald Reagan and said, why don't we do this, change the negotiations, and they did that. But the Reagan administration insisted on verification measures that were so difficult that, of course, the Russians would never accept them, and the negotiations finally came to an end. So a little bit of a trip down memory lane for me to think back on that when I was here in Vienna in 1973. But my most personal link between 1973 and 2024 is based on the short tour of Vienna that I was treated to by the U.S. Embassy driver when I arrived at the airport, and he was taking me to my hotel. And the tour he offered me to just drive me around town, since I'd never been to Vienna before, and to give me a little guided tour. And as we got to Schwarzenbergplatz, he said, what they say about that? That's the monument over there. That's the Soviet War Memorial. And he said, what they say about it? I said, no, I have no idea what they say about it. And he said, what they say is this is the only Russian soldier who never stole a watch in Vienna. The message to me was pretty clear, just as it is to you. It's much less clear to me today, particularly as I look at Austrian politics, including the very worrisome links to Russian intelligence and to President Putin. So I come here as someone who loves Austria, but am very concerned about the future of the country as well as the future of my country. So those are some factors that are in the background. But I'll talk first about the current challenges facing European security and the role of NATO and the EU in meeting those challenges. I'll dip into a little history to discuss how we arrived at the current situation. My presentation will conclude with some comments on what members of the EU and NATO must do to face the future. And I'll talk a little bit about the uncertainties facing us today and anticipating that future. First, the current situation. European security has been directly threatened by a Russian invasion of Ukraine with soldiers who have engaged in far more than stealing watches. The members of NATO and the European Union have largely been united in condemning Russian aggression and supporting Ukraine. Russia, for its part, is getting critical assistance from other countries. Important that you think about those other countries and what kind of countries, what kind of regimes they have. China, North Korea, Iran. Those are Russia's key allies and making a big difference, really, in the war at this point. So Russia and its allies have something in common. They're all led by authoritarian regimes that seek to replace Western democratic leadership of the international system with a style of leadership that is more friendly toward autocratic governments. Russian President Putin has been quite explicit in declaring that this is one of his goals in Ukraine, not just defeating Ukraine, but defeating the West. The main institutions representing the West are the European Union and NATO. But we shouldn't forget that the United Nations and most of the international organizations that constitute the global international system are created largely with the values that underlie the West, and in fact were created by the West. Today, cooperation between NATO and the European Union is as good as it has been in years. This is important at a time when European and transatlantic security are more threatened than they have been since the end of the Cold War. The earnest desire of countries to join NATO and the EU to protect their democracies and enhance their economic well-being have required both organizations to grow. Sometimes this has been opposed by some resistance by some members of the two organizations. But the most recent enlargement has been the entry of EU members Finland and Sweden into NATO. Russian aggression against Ukraine convinced both former neutral states to seek entry. They sought to join NATO even though they were already members of the European Union. That's significant to our topic tonight. Logically, the European Union could become what the United States, since the Kennedy administration, has referred to as the European pillar of the Transatlantic Alliance. In 1984, when I wrote the first of my books on transatlantic security, I called for a new transatlantic bargain in which the European allies would take on a larger portion of the burdens and leadership of European defense. I was playing off the term transatlantic bargain that was originated by U.S. Ambassador to NATO Harlan Cleveland. I added the word new to represent the need for positive reform of the alliance. The term new transatlantic bargain has been used ever since by a variety of analysts and organizations to express the need for what I first suggested in 1984. But at the end of the Cold War, most European allies collected their peace dividend, and that gutted their defense establishments and also undermined the possibilities for Europe to take on this added responsibility. The progressive weakening of European defense efforts also reduced the potential for a serious European pillar for the alliance. The decline deepened when the United Kingdom went down the Brexit path along the lines that it was strongly favored by, guess who? Russian President Putin, who supported the idea of Brexit both openly and clandestinely. By the way, I don't accept the argument that NATO enlargement increased the threat to Russia and therefore produced the conflict in East-West relations that we have today. Putin has always been aware that NATO, being a consensus-based organization, could never initiate an out-of-the-blue attack on Russia. What Putin did fear, in my opinion, and still does fear, is that the success of Western-style democracies on Russia's borders would set an example undermining Russia's internal control over its people. Maintaining that internal control, by the way, remains a key Putin objective, at the same time that he seeks to force Ukraine back into the control of Mother Russia. The confluence of recent events has convinced many Western experts that defense budgets need to be increased substantially and that the time for a new transatlantic bargain has arrived. A recent letter produced by the Alphen Group, and you may not have heard of the Alphen Group, but if you haven't, you probably will hear more about it in the future. It's a group of American and your informal group of European and American defense and security and foreign policy experts and retired officials. And we produced a letter to governments in advance of the 75th anniversary of NATO that's coming up in July. And in that letter, we said, most equitable burden sharing will not lead to an autonomous European pillar outside NATO, but rather promote greater European strategic responsibility inside the framework of the Transatlantic Alliance more broadly. This approach would reflect the continuing necessity of American contributions to deterrence and defense and of the transatlantic link. It will not, nor should it, inhibit the members of the European Union from developing security cooperation among themselves, which will enhance European capabilities and cooperation in NATO. The report explicitly recommends that the European allies and Canada should aim to deliver 2/3, 67% of NATO's combined operational capacity for collective defense, as measured by rapidly usable forces, enablers, and other capabilities to execute and advance plans across the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO's area of responsibility. Today, the United States, in many cases, many of these categories provides 70, 80, or even 90% of those capabilities. So it's a big task ahead for Europe to take its reasonable responsibility in the alliance. Please excuse me if I'm not completely diplomatic, but Austria is one of the most prominent free riders on the security provided by the United States and other allies. In the 1990s, I wrote a report for the Congress on the topic of what I call the former neutrals and NATO. At that time, it seemed that there were no longer two opposing sides between which to be neutral. Today, I guess the Cold War rationale could be applied to the new hot or Cold War between Russia and the West. But Austria already abandoned true neutrality when it became a member of the European Union, and then supported all the security commitments involved in the EU's aspirational agreements. It sadly appears that a country that is so dear to me is tempted to enjoy the security and economic benefits of its place in the West while flirting with the authoritarian country that shares none of the common values on which Austrian government and society have been based. Let me add a few words of concern about my own country. Some of my colleagues in the Alphen group, Hans Binnendijk, Rich Hooker, and Ambassador Sandy Vershbow, recently published an article under the title, "NATO Cannot Survive Without America." This obviously was inspired by the threat of a possible Trump II presidency. Their judgment, confirmed by one of the authors who served in the Trump White House, is that Donald Trump, if given a second term, would try much harder to take the United States out of NATO than he did in his first term. His pledge to tell Russian leaders to do whatever the hell they want with underperforming European states should be taken seriously, particularly given his apparent admiration for President Putin. Sadly, this admiration for President Putin apparently is shared with some Austrian politicians. The implications for these three authors are very clear. They say the European Union is not in a position to take NATO's place anytime soon, as its military capabilities are limited and more capable of managing regional crises than fighting major wars. Even if a rump NATO survives without strong American involvement, the challenges of divided leadership, inadequate deterrence, and an assertive adversary would heighten the risk of war with Russia, a major power bent on overturning the liberal international system. In a chapter that I wrote of a volume that is going to be released in the coming weeks, I concluded something very similar when I said, without the United States, NATO would not have been created in 1949, would not have overcome the Soviet challenge during the Cold War, would not have continued as a vital alliance in the post-Cold War world, and will not last into the future. And I added the question, even with an ambitious set of EU goals and dramatic increases in European defense spending, American capabilities and commitments will remain essential to the alliance in the near future. Now, after this very summary approach to our topic tonight, let me just summarize where I'm coming from. I want you to understand that I believe the security of Europe is threatened more than any time since the end of the Cold War. The destabilizing factor is Russia's aggression against Ukraine and President Putin's objectives to weaken the West. The goal is actively supported by China, Iran, and North Korea. NATO and EU members have declared their support for Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity, but they haven't provided enough assistance to Ukraine to bring Russia to the bargaining table. For Putin, the target is not just Ukraine, but also the West. Institutional cooperation between NATO and the EU is better than at many times since the end of the Cold War. But the future is clouded by divisions among EU members and uncertainty regarding future U.S. foreign and security policy. The future well-being of the West now requires political unity and effective defenses against the challenges posed by Russia and its allies. It will also require European states to take more responsibility for their own defense. No state, including Austria, can hide behind supposed neutrality while benefiting from the security provided by its EU partners and by NATO. I look forward to hearing Alena Kudzko's presentation and then to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stanley Sloan, for your honest and sober remarks. I suppose there is a lot of food for thought for the discussion, and I will certainly also invite the audience for questions and answers after hearing from Alena Kudzko. Thank you very much again for being with us. May I also ask you for your introductory remarks?
Thank you so much. Is it okay if I stay here?
Absolutely.
Or you prefer? Okay. I'm in a lucky position because Professor Sloan already said all the important things that need to be done, so I can cherry pick on the pieces of it and fill in a little bit maybe with the more in-depth details or a perspective. But I want to start with a bigger picture. Indeed, as you heard, but also many of you started the history of the European integration of Europe, and you know that over the past several decades, there were several periods in history where Europeans would say, oh yes, we need to do more, we need to contribute more to defense and security. And somehow, usually, nothing really came out of that. Why do we think that this time is different? Simply because the situation is so bad that Europe no longer can afford to procrastinate. I absolutely agree that our troubles are of our own doing, but I wanted to elaborate a little bit on this logic of procrastination that Europe had over the past 30 years. It's typically assumed or simplified to say that Europeans were just cynical free riders who didn't want to spend on defense just because Americans were doing the job for us. But I think the situation actually was much more profound, and that's why it's much more difficult to change it. First, Europeans actually thought that they're doing the right thing and that they're behaving responsibly. Why did we think that? First, absorbing the peace dividend was economically more efficient. European governments actually thought that they're doing the right thing, taking the money, spending it on social programs, on education, on economy, on everything imaginable. Why they thought it's the right thing? Europeans simply believe that war is obsolete. Nobody seriously could imagine that there is going to be a real, more traditional types of warfare where tanks are going to be crawling against each other. Europeans thought that hard power is irrelevant, and not just because they didn't have it, but because they really could not comprehend that such things can happen in the future. Instead, Europeans betted on the future where the conflict will happen, but the conflict will be mostly along economic front lines. Our economies will compete against each other. Maybe there is going to be some cyber attacks, maybe there is going to be some technological attacks, sabotage, but nobody is really going to be throwing tanks and ammunition at each other. And the conflicts that Europe thought are still out there were of limited nature. For example, fight against terrorism. And importantly, these conflicts were far away from Europe. So Europeans, of course, mistakenly thought that all the crises that remain in the world are going to be of the type where Europeans can choose when to engage, how to engage, and at what timelines to engage. And of course, on top of that, Europeans thought that the United States are going to be there in the long term. All that led Europeans to be rather actually proud and content about ourselves and thinking we're doing the best thing imaginable for our societies, so we definitely shouldn't be criticized for doing something immoral or irresponsible. And of course, the war in Ukraine has shattered all these assumptions that Europeans have had so far. First, the fact that war is obsolete. You don't need a clear illustrations that hard power matters. Of course, all these other types of power still matter, economic, technological, but you still need to make sure that you have tanks and you have ammunition. Second one, Europeans also had their belief in the power of economy shattered. Not just in the power of economy as the means of competition, but also their belief that Europe is doing so great in terms of single market integration, in terms of industry's economy, that they can mobilize whenever they want, and if necessary, they can produce whatever tanks or ammunition is needed. Now it's probably one of the biggest shocks that Europeans are having. If you look at the numbers, Europe should have no problem defeating Russia. European GDP last time I checked, was 10 times bigger than that of Russia. We're in a different league when it comes to technological innovation, different tech components of economy. Even contrary to common assumptions, even the military budget of the European Union collectively is about 3 times bigger than that of Russia. So if you look at the numbers, we should have absolutely no problem in making sure that Ukraine can win easily. Yet we do have a giant problem. Why is that? This is the war of attrition, which means that this is the war of industrial capacities. Russians understood it very well and started to organize to achieve this goal. Most recent evidence of that is the appointment of the new defense minister, who actually has nothing to do with the military. He's an economist. And his single job and mission is to make sure that the entire Russian economy is absolutely aligned with military needs and can produce what's needed for the military, and that it's economically structured that way as well. Europe so far still has not comprehended the fact that to make sure that you can leverage the power of your collective single market, you actually also need to organize for that. We started thinking about that, but still the road ahead is very long and very dangerous. And another important factor is that the business, how Europe knew it, but also how America knew it, has changed as well. The entire Western economy, actually entire global economy, including the military production, was based on the simple factor just-in-time delivery. We produced just enough things that are given at the right moment. But now what we see, we need to produce for just in case. We need to make sure that we have stockpiles, that we have spare capacities to make sure that we have things available when we need them. This is totally economically inefficient. Any business person who would look at that would have a heart attack because it destroys business plans. But this is the way in which the world is going, and Europe and the United States have no chance to adjust to that. The good thing is that Europeans finally understand that all these factors have changed, and what they thought was responsible behavior before is now totally irresponsible behavior, and the world surrounding Europe will no longer allow the European Union, us Europeans, to engage in it. So where does it leave us now, and what are probably the best policies going forward? And again, the caveat is when I'm saying the best, it does not necessarily mean that we're going to implement all the best policies, but it does help to steer the conversation in that direction. First thing, and that's the biggest disclaimer probably of the conversation today, especially when we talk about Europe, the European Union's role in defense and security, the role of Europe is that Europeans still think that NATO is the guarantor of security in Europe. Nobody is talking about abandoning NATO or fully replacing NATO with European capabilities. Again, as Professor Sloan so eloquently said, it's about building up the European pillar of NATO, both because simply in any objective reality, it's going to take Europeans way too long to fully be able to replace the United States, but also it's not necessarily in anybody's interest. So what do Europeans still need to do better in security? The first thing is pretty straightforward. It's capabilities. Last year, NATO announced their new defense plans that are pretty comprehensive, probably the most comprehensive plans since the Cold War. And to make sure that Europeans, but also NATO forces can deliver the capabilities that are needed to implement these plans, we need to increase what we have by about 1/3, which means that we need to spend around 50% more on defense than we do today, which means about 3% of GDP. Only 2 countries in Europe now reach 3% of GDP, that's Poland and Greece. And in Greece, much of this is spent actually on pensions and not really on capabilities. And what's also important to remember that when we say that we're going to have X number of billions in our GDP for defense, only 20% of this goes into actual capabilities, into the equipment or armaments or ammunition. The rest is spent on maintaining what we have or on social packages, on pensions, and so on. So there's still a lot that we need to do, and we need to make sure that this spending is actually consistent over the years if we want to have a chance. Second point, and that's what I was talking about when we say that we need to organize ourselves, is that we need to properly look at our defense industries and make sure that we have a coherent industry, both on the European continent, but also on the other side of the Atlantic. The problems that we have now, especially in Europe, the defense industry is incredibly fragmented. We have a lot of small providers delivering for small needs of small armies here and there. European industry is also, because of that, extremely inefficient. We're wasting loads of money because we produce 1 million different types of this equipment, 1 million different types of that equipment, and we cannot produce them at scale. It's, of course, by necessity rather protectionist, because every country wants to have their own producers and is not that eager to share or go into joint purchases with other countries. But there's also this dilemma that we see very clearly in the case of Ukraine. On the one hand, we understand that Ukraine needs things right now. Ukraine needs ammunition right now. Ukraine needs weapons right now. But Europe doesn't have it. So what Europe needs to do, go buy it elsewhere. But if you buy it elsewhere and spend the money on foreign producers, you don't have the money to invest in your European industry. So it's kind of a catch-22 where you torn apart this necessity to buy right now, but also necessity to invest in your own future capabilities. And another problem that we have in Europe, which is solvable in the long run, but creates a little bit of a misperception about European industries, is that we often produce a lot, but much of what we produce in Europe goes to service contracts with foreign entities. Around 40% of the ammunition that is produced in Europe right now goes abroad. And of course, if you are a private company, and most of the military industrial companies in Europe are private, you say, I cannot just say the state or the company with which I have a contract that I'm going to renege on this contract and redirect my production to Ukraine or to European needs. It would simply destroy my business. And since Europeans don't give long-term contracts, businesses also are not that enticed to change their business model. So we have a lot of these things that need to be sorted out. But of course, on top of all of this is the question of money. We already talked about the need to increase defense spending, but increase them not just for 1 year to come, but significantly increase them for many years in the futures. And we'll have to live with the fact that it's not going to be discussed every year whether it makes sense or not. It will have to be almost guaranteed to give also certainty to defense industries. But also what we increasingly have in Europe, US is doing better with that, is that public spending will never be enough to pay for everything we need for defense and security. Europe needs to find a way to make sure that private capital invests in European defenses, and that actually these investments are simplified. Now, for example, a lot of banks would not want to provide capital for defense companies because they say it's against environmental and sustainability goals that are imposed of us. Nice, but that really prevents companies from having any extra source of financing to increase capacities. Or another example where Americans, again, are doing much better. In the US, there's private capital markets where even like normal people who ever own shares can invest into the defense companies. In Europe, private capital and capital markets don't really exist that much. They do, but they're fragmented, small, overly regulated, and so on. And again, so Europe is just starved of this private capital that needs to be done, that needs to be invested. And I'll conclude by a little bit elaborating how the European Union can be part of the solution. Of course, much of this is being done at the member states level, and it will continue being done at the member states level. But probably the European Union is the entity and the most interesting discovery both for Europeans themselves and also for Americans since the start of the war in Ukraine. As you remember, and that was alluded to before that, Americans had very ambiguous relations towards the European Union. The joke is many Americans didn't even understand how it works, and when it did, it was too complicated to engage. But also Europeans themselves were very skeptical about whether European Union can be a meaningful contributor to defense and security. In the end, it was designed and created for totally different roles. But now what we see in Ukraine, European Union is not just complementary, but it can take on tasks that are pretty novel and pretty fundamentally breaking out with the tradition. What I mean here, European Union already now is providing direct military support to Ukraine. Through the European peace facilities, they're financing effectively purchases of weapons and transfers of weapons for Ukraine. And Europeans are also doing training missions under the EU label for the Ukrainian soldiers. This is something that even NATO is not doing. Much of the support that is provided to Ukraine is not through NATO. It's officially on bilateral basis because NATO is worried that it might stimulate Russians to think that NATO wants to become a party of war. So the European Union is already doing something that's pretty untraditional and breaking with tradition that it had. But also, again, in the case of Ukraine, we understand how security and defense now is increasingly multifaceted, and it's impossible to revert it back to simply to defense and the hardware capabilities. It was the European Union who was the best partner for the United States to make sure that we have more or less coherent sanctions regime. It was the European Union that could leverage the power of its markets and finances to make sure we can provide financial aid to Ukraine and also macroeconomic support. And of course, European Union took care of the refugees that are coming into Europe and provided humanitarian support and so on. Still, a lot of things can be done also at the European level, and I'll just give you a flavor of a couple of them to stimulate the discussion later. First one, we discuss capabilities. Again, NATO is the entity that defines what countries actually need. But what the EU can help with is to actually use this regulatory power for good, which means to regulate it and stimulate countries in a way that these capabilities become standardized and synchronized. That's extremely important also for defense industries to make sure that it's more efficient and that instead of 100 different types of ammunition, we can produce maybe 10. Defense industry. Markets are bread and butter of the European Union, and that's actually the area where the EU is already jumping on pretty aggressively in a good way, trying to stimulate the domestic industries, both by creating the possibilities for funding, but also incentivizing joint procurements by, for example, offering tax incentives in case you procure jointly, or providing also financial support. And of course, there are also other areas where EU was important in the past and will be important in the future. We still did not solve the issue of military mobility. We might have the fantastic troop station somewhere in Germany, but we still need to make sure that they can reach to Estonia before Russian troops can reach Berlin. Second thing, of course, we still need to care a lot, even more now, about cybersecurity. Much of the sabotage that's done by Russia is happening now in cybersecurity spectrum and already happening in all our countries, and the EU can do a lot to help with this area of protection. And finally, much of today's warfare is also about new technologies or dual-use technologies. As much as Ukrainians use tanks and ammunition, they also rely heavily on drones, on electronic warfare. Much of these capabilities are developed by the civilian sector and then transferred to the military sector. So the EU can leverage also its power of innovation, its power to leverage technology to help with the security of it all. And I'll finish with a quote. It's the quote of Kurt Vonnegut, and technically shouldn't do much with defense and security, but I think it's illustrative. He said once, "We'll go down in history as the first society that would not save itself because it was not cost effective." And my plea to all of you is, when we're thinking about cost efficiency and what's cost effective in today's world, we should also consider whether our prioritization of cost saving and cost efficiency might not eventually mean that we're going to kill ourselves instead of focusing on the bigger goal.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Alena Kudzko, for your remarks, for also reminding us of the very relevant economic/industrial component of security and of defense, that we must not underestimate it when we talk about procurement, when we talk about increasing defense capabilities for the European market and leveraging that bread and butter potential of the EU market in increasing also the capabilities in Europe. Yeah. Before we open the floor for questions from the audience, I have questions prepared, follow-up questions to each of you. Stan, I will start again with you, since we have already mentioned, as briefly introduced at the beginning, the so-called elephant in the room, the US elections that are coming up in November. What are your takes on these two extreme eventualities of either Trump or Biden being re-elected as president for the future of transatlantic relations? What are also for us here in Europe the most important implications that you can predict and foresee for each of these two eventualities?
Do we have 8 or 9 hours to talk about this? It is a big elephant in the room, no question about that. As a way of background, I have been a very strong critic of former President. I prefer to refer to him as former President Trump. And already in the first year he was in office, I was asked by an organization to write an article about President Trump and NATO. And the title of it was Historic Alliance Meets a Historic President. And that remains a fact, not only ahistoric, but full of lies and bad intentions toward the alliance and toward Europe in general, toward the EU as well, not just NATO. The situation, if you look at the polls right now, it doesn't look too great if you're a fan of President Biden. I'm not too concerned about that because I think there are a lot of factors that will lead to benefiting Biden in the long run. There are a lot of people who are undecided at this point, and I think that a lot of people are concerned by President Biden's age, and I can understand that. He shows his age a bit, but I think his policies and decision-making still seems to be very solid, and I suppose I'm saying that because I'm just a little under a year younger than he is, but I feel at still in your 80s, if you've been very engaged and active, you can keep going making good, effective decisions. I knew President Biden when he was a senator. He commissioned several of the studies that I did on NATO. He's always been a very big fan of NATO, and if you look at what he said when he came into the presidency, he said that he was going to be very supportive of alliances and international cooperation, and he has done that. I think he has followed that path. The problem is that Donald Trump is getting support from people who are unhappy for, let's say, a variety of reasons. Some of them are simply economically disadvantaged. They don't feel that the system has benefited them, and they feel that somebody like Trump, don't ask me why, I can't understand the mentality, but they feel like somebody like Trump is going to throw the system up in the air and it'll come down in a better way for them. I think there's been some interesting analysis done on people feeling disadvantaged because the technology world that we're living in now leaves so many of them behind, and they don't feel comfortable in that world of technology, and they relate to Trump's message of very simplifying everything, even if it's very wrong. And there are just some people who are sort of anti-government in general, and these people are also part of the MAGA crowd. So at this point, it looks a little bit like a competition between good and bad, virtue and evil, and but I say that because I am obviously a critic of the former president. I try to be confident that, in fact, in the end, Biden will get a slim victory and will pull it out. But I remain, even if this is the outcome, I'm very concerned about a country, my country, where so many millions of people will support somebody like Donald Trump. It's just something that I find hard to understand. I've tried to suggest some of the reasons that I think people do. But the fact is that it's a huge problem for our country, just as I think it's a problem for your country, for Austria, that so many people feel that they want to support a party with such strong links to Moscow, and that basically comes from the right side, the far right of the political spectrum. I'll conclude just by saying in 2018 I published a book called Transatlantic Traumas: Will Illiberalism Bring the West to the Brink of Defeat? And forget that was the brink of collapse, I think was what it was. In that study, I warned about the radical right in all the European countries where the radical right had become on the rise, and in the United States. And I think that what I recommended in that study was very much directed at society and government rather than foreign policy. I suggested that centrist, center-left, center-right politicians and people needed to focus more on something that I called radical centrist populism. In other words, a form of centrism that in fact tries to move ahead to solve problems, but does it in the middle of the political spectrum, bringing left-wing and right-wing politicians on board with centrist but progressive solutions. There was an article in the New York Times just a couple of days ago that said that the writer suggested that this new form of centrism was in fact emerging in the United States. I'm not convinced yet, but if it is, I think it's a good thing. So I'm hopeful about the election, but I'm not overconfident.
Thank you, Stan. Alena, you mentioned in your remarks the importance of a more coherent defense industry, and also the fact that there is a dire need for more production of scale. The threat and the lack of going elsewhere to buy, to produce outside the European Union. Of course, one of the most profound examples in the most recent past was the procurement of Poland not going to an European provider of tanks and of airplanes, but going international to buy large amount of tanks. I think it was roughly 1,000 and several hundred airplanes from South Korea, which surprised many, but when looking at it more closely, it was the most cost-efficient, probably also thing to do for Poland at that time, and probably even today. So my question to you would be, against also the development of the new European industrial defense strategy, how do you see the potential here? Can this new strategy that was just launched at the beginning of this year provide for this appetite, this growing appetite for a more coherent, comprehensive defense industry in Europe?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. On South Korea, besides being probably a good value proposition for money, it's also was the proposition that was available on the markets.
True.
You didn't have to wait years in line to make sure that you can get your tanks, you can get them much faster. And another good example that shows the dilemmas even more in a more pronounced manner is the example of ammunition. Europeans promised to deliver to Ukraine 1 million in ammunition until March last year, could not produce that, still hope that maybe in half a year from now we can deliver from the European production. But what's interesting there, unlike in the case of tanks, it's also not so easy to buy it on international markets. And that's exactly the example which is being pointed out, that we do need to make sure we take care of what we can control and produce in-house. Why it's not easy to buy at the international markets? Actually, the Czechs had this fantastic initiative. There was an announcement in February that the Czechs found about 800,000 ammunition around the world. And found meaning they identified the countries, the producers who have this ammunition available and from whom technically we collectively can buy. And a lot of European countries got excited. Actually, everybody is chipping in for the Czech initiative, giving cash, like, please, dear Czech friends, go buy the ammunition. The trick is that in many cases, these countries, they are either former allies of the Soviet Union or the countries that still do not want to fully disrupt their relations with Russia. And of course, Russians are doing their own part of the game and trying to proactively go to these countries and warn them that don't you dare sell it to the Czechs or to the European Union because it's going to have consequences for you. So even to buy certain supplies at the international markets right now is a cat and mouse games, and there's huge competition who can get hands on the necessary supplies in the fastest manner possible. Now, at the European level, I do think that the European Defense Industrial Strategy that was issued in March is an important element indicating the direction of the development. We do need to remember that it wasn't yet approved by the Parliament or by the Council, so for now it's the idea and the proposal, and as always there are a lot of parties who need to entities, Parliament, Council, Member States who need to get on board behind this initiative. But I think it's a very important indication that there is at least philosophical readiness in Europe to go in this direction. And of course, it's preparation also for the work of the new Commission. There is absolutely serious discussion now that it makes sense to have a separate defense portfolio in the Commission. The debate is now whether we can resource it, whether the Commissioner can get meaningful competencies to make sure that they can actually implement the ideas that they have, but it's going in this direction. And again, what's important about the defense industrial strategy, they're trying to incentivize joint procurements. The way to do it is, to put it blatantly, make sure that it's money-wise beneficial for everybody who is involved. So they're suggesting different schemes, tax rebates, or direct financial injections to start moving in this direction. The problem is that we don't really have money to stimulate all these wonderful projects and to stimulate the joint procurement. So much will depend on whether Europeans collectively will find the resources that can be channeled in this direction as well. But I do think that it's an important step forward, but we still need to do a lot of things to make sure it happens.
So it's money and political will that will determine.
That's usually the
whether
two
we
biggest
can move,
problems in everything.
True. From theory to
Yeah.
practice. Yeah. Thank you. Stan, I also have a follow-up question, one more for you. Despite the fact that, of course, we can foresee that with a potential President Trump, the transatlantic relations might deteriorate further, the general outlook of national security, national strategy in the US is, in general, over the last couple of years, tending to move more from a transatlantic, Europe-centered approach more towards China, more towards the Pacific, the Indo-Pacific region. How do you determine that shift also in the future, also probably vis-a-vis the not only upcoming elections, but the general sentiment in the US security architecture, security atmosphere? Is, from your perspective, China indeed the entity to look out more closely than focus on Europe in national security matters?
Well, it's absolutely true that the focus in the United States has become much more on China as the future threat to be concerned about. And that's sort of in the strategic community, that basically is the approach. I think the problem is that dealing with a threat from China is a very different thing from dealing with a threat from Russia, and requires very different approaches. I think sometimes people who talk about the threat from China ignore the fact that something that strategically needs to be considered is the extent to which the Chinese and American and the Chinese and European economies are so thoroughly linked in terms of both sales and purchases. And that's a factor that can be a strength or a weakness. It can be a strength if China has to be more cautious because of the fact that it depends on sales in Europe and the United States. Or it can be weakness that we depend on China for some things, particularly in some areas of precious minerals and so forth, that we have some dependencies on China that represent a weakness for the West. I don't think that the United States has tilted so far that you say we've gone to a China focus and Europe is getting left behind. I don't see that happening. Mm-hmm. The public opinion polls that I've seen, and most recently, suggest that Americans still strongly support NATO. And that doesn't mean that we're totally happy with NATO, but it does mean that most Americans think NATO is a good thing. There also is strong sentiment that Europeans ought to take more responsibility for their own defense, and that's something that Trump obviously plays on. He gets some support because of the fact that he's taken such a strong line on burden sharing and criticizing the Europeans. But the strategic community in the United States sees this as something where the Europeans ought to be more concerned about China than they have been. And we've seen in recent NATO summits, in the last couple of summits, the Europeans have been convinced by Americans that they ought to start talking about the concern about threats from China. And so we look at the recent communiques from NATO summits, and you see the language that it doesn't discuss China as a threat, because European countries aren't necessarily there yet in terms of using that language. But certainly China is perceived as a challenge and one that needs to be taken into account. And I think that on transatlantic basis, we're moving toward more of a consensus as a result of that. The United States, one of the reasons that this report that we produced, the Alphen Group produced, is to show Europeans that it is possible for them and necessary for them to take on more responsibility for their own defense. It doesn't mean substituting for the United States completely. It just means relieving some of the U.S. burden so the United States can maintain more balance or achieve more balance in its defensive efforts and provide some defensive capabilities for Asia that are needed there. And also in a crisis, the Europeans have to be thinking about the fact that the United States might have to pull forces out of Europe or rededicate forces to a crisis in Asia, and that we need to be prepared for that. I think it's in the strategic community. There's this feeling that Europe really needs to move in the direction of what I call for 1984, and so I'm encouraged that I'm seeing on the European side some greater recognition that this is important, but I also understand that we have some communication issues across the Atlantic. In the United States, when people talk about Europe, they tend to think that it's a thing, that it exists. And well, I put it the other way. The Obama administration tended to act like Europe existed and was trying to talk to Europe as if Europe existed. And those of us who work on Europe on the U.S. side realize that Europe exists in some ways, but not in others. And that the national instincts and interests still play a very large role. And we've heard a little bit of this on the military-industrial side. And it's just one of the realities, particularly in defense and security, but also in many ways. And sometimes Europeans don't help, particularly those that are very, very pro-European Union, in making statements that lead Americans to think that Europe exists. And I think it's important for Americans to understand that Europe exists, but only in some areas and not in others. And when we deal with Europe, we have to understand we're dealing with some things that involve the European Union, some things that can only be handled through bilateral relationships. So I'm not concerned that the United States is going to move completely away from Europe, but I am concerned that Europeans take this seriously and move toward taking more responsibility for their own defense, because this will become necessary.
Yeah, and that has been a clear statement by you, Stan, but of course also Alena, by you mentioning before the necessity to increase also the capabilities. And just probably to follow up on what Stan just said, I'd like to ask you also one last follow-up question from my side. We are in this conundrum of, on the one side, we can establish that NATO is, of course, the key factor in European security at the moment. At the other side, we would like to see more burden sharing, would like to see more capabilities being built up by the EU as well. You mentioned before this necessity that the EU strengthens its NATO pillar. Now, vis-a-vis the German-French relationship, probably also this new emerging so-called Weimar Triangle with Poland also in the picture. How do you see the potential here? Can these three countries combined lift up the capabilities and live up to the potential?
As a Central European, I must say that in general, Central Europeans, of course, feel vindicated from the point of view that there's been a lot of much more realistic assessment of the threat from Russia for years, and the countries in the region have been doing much more. What's interesting right now is that Poland can channel this I've been right moments into constructive cooperation with other partners in Europe. It's not easy, it requires a lot of diplomatic effort, it requires a lot of action on your side, but the movement has started. Of course, the challenge that we have right now is not necessarily that France, Germany, and Poland are hostile towards each other or have some, of course, that's exaggeration, or that they have some challenges in bilateral relations. The challenge is always there. What's important is that both Germany and France, in many ways, are very distracted by domestic political developments and have rather limited bandwidth to devote the necessary attention, and the attention that's necessary is of enormous proportion. They do not have enough bandwidth to spend as much time as it would take on handling the relations with other Europeans or dedicating their energy to making sure that Europe collectively can do better, be it on defense and security or on other issues, simply because of domestic uncertainties, political processes, elections, uncertainty whether the ruling government can win, and so on. But I do think that this is something new and fresh that's adding new dynamics to the relations within Europe as well. Of course, Poland is trying to play the role of a little bit almost like a mediator that can take the best of both sides and push the entire conversation forward. That's an ambition, but of course, France and Germany have both a lot to say and contribute. Both sides have a lot of ideas, especially France has always been very ambitious with ideas. So I personally support all possible initiatives that can convert any ideas that are constructive and going in the right direction that can help convert them into reality. So it's a useful vehicle. I don't think it's the only vehicle that is necessary for Europe to achieve the progress that's necessary, but it's a good contribution.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I'd like now to also invite the audience for questions. I see a couple of hands being raised already. We will collect a round of questions, maybe of 3-4 questions. And we have approximately 20 to 30 minutes left, so we will have at least some time for then a second round of questions. I'll start here in the first row with the gentleman here, and then moving on in the first row, and then moving back. Thank you very much. Please introduce yourself and keep your question short.
My name is Guy Vinet. I'm French. I'm sorry for that.
No problem.
And I'm a former staff of the OSCE. So you see my question coming. You mentioned, Mr. Sloan and Mrs. Sloan, some organization working on the transatlantic link and relationship. But as far as I remember, you did not mention the OSCE. So could you say something about that? And do you see any role of the OSCE in this relationship? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very relevant question. Of course, we shouldn't leave the OSCE out of the picture. Here we have another question in the first row.
Yeah.
Yes?
Yes.
Is it working?
Okay. Yeah. Jun Saito, University of Vienna. And my question is at first to you, Ms. Professor Sloan. So you mentioned you talk about the Austria or another neutral states as free rider of security provided by NATO. And sure, Austrian politicians would get angered with your comment, and ordinary so an argument against that is, sure, Austria is neutral country, but Austria contributes so many soldiers to peacekeeping operations, especially in Western Balkans. Mm-hmm. And what do you think about this argument against your argument? And the second question is, what do you think about the merit of NATO for the USA? Because NATO Secretary General always pointed out that NATO invokes the Article 5 for the first time in the history to protect United States after September 11th, and also economically, the NATO brings the merit for US labor market. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah. Gudrun Matt from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, please.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much. Very interesting to listening to your analysis and remarks from an Austrian point of view. Austria as a country, military neutral, but never neutral when it comes to values. or the breach of international law, and also with a very firm standpoint and position with regard to Russia's war of aggression. And in this regard, you mentioned China. I would be interested in listening to your analysis and insights about China's role and potential future role also with regard to European security architecture and Russia's war of aggression. Thanks.
Thank you very much for these very relevant questions. Yes, let's take one more question here, and then let's move to a round of answers before going to another round of questions.
Thank you very much for the conversation. My name is Christina, and I'm studying economics, in fact. And my question is regarding the supply chains and the inefficiency of the European military industry, and how it is not disintegrated it is, and how inefficient. Let's say that it is going to be integrated. There should be a country where these capacities are centralized, and therefore there must be a country and administration which is leading these integrated military capacities. Which country that could be? Because economically, I think Germany would have the potential for that, but when it comes to political weight, then France might have overweight Germany because it's a member of the P5, and it is also having the nuclear capacity, the nuclear missiles. And my second question is, you were talking about that Europe should have taken more responsibility in defending itself. In Europe as such, do you include the United Kingdom or not? Because geographically it should have been, but historically it has always been very skeptical and reluctant when it's coming to any type of European integration, deepening the relationships, let alone extending this cooperation in the European Union to a military level. When it is featured with so many secrets and confidential data, then how could it be possible?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think we have several very relevant and very important questions. Alena, I'd like to start with you now. Please feel free to answer some of the questions that have been raised, probably especially with regards to OSCE as well, which certainly is one of the most relevant ones in my opinion as well.
Yeah, sadly, I think that OSCE has become irrelevant and has not delivered on much over the past years. Part of it because there's still the internal sabotage that's going on from the Russian side, which prevents much of the action that can be done. I do think OSCE can still play an important role in terms of election observation missions. That I see value, even trying to do it even in countries that do not actively cooperate, be it Russia or Belarus. There's still value in trying to push forward this agenda and try to develop this election observation capacity. In terms of actual provision of security, stability in Europe, I'm a little bit skeptical about what the path forward can be without serious reform or change of the rules of the organization. Now, supply chains and economy. I don't think actually, the beauty is that there's so much that needs to be produced that you can distribute it around Europe to make sure that more countries are happy. It doesn't have to be concentrated in one country. By the way, even already now, plenty of European countries have good defense industries that are working also to supply others. Take Sweden, for example, a new NATO member, but even countries like Poland or Italy, they all have defense capacities. So the trick is that it can be distributed across Europe, and important to remember, yes, we will need to enforce that supply chains are also spread around the countries, that it's not too concentrated in one country, but actually the more it's distributed, the more other countries will be willing to accept it. The typical good example that mentioned from other areas is Airbus. That's probably one of the most successful instances of consolidation of European industries. And why it flew? It's also because the supply chains are so distributed that pretty much every member state of the European Union has some local production capacity that contributes to the success of Airbus, so everybody in the end benefits. So it would have to be something along these lines where everybody gets a piece of something. my easy answer for the UK, I personally think that they're part of the security in Europe. How to bring them in is, of course, a matter of debate. Of course, there are some areas that will be difficult, more difficult than others. UK is member of the Five Eyes, together with the US and others. I'm very skeptical that can be expanded to the collaboration with European states. Especially, I'm skeptical that maybe Austria or Hungary would be easily let in anywhere close to this cooperation. So in some areas, there is much more that can be done. Some areas I still think will be very restricted for cooperation. Just very brief comment on China. China actually already is playing a very important and unclear in terms of eventual circumstances role in defense and security of Europe. Russia is working with China on making sure that they have access to technological components necessary, but also for economic support from China. China has the capacity to make this support even more pronounced and provide Russia with the weapons even more directly and aggressively, rather than the rather coveted ways that China is deploying right now. So it can be a joker that might define eventually how the war in Ukraine can develop.
Thank you so much. Although these are not very optimistic outlooks, Stanley, do you have anything more positive for us, or do you agree with Alena?
I didn't get the clear idea of what you were asking about. You're asking about the opposing perspective to one that I offered on Austria.
The free rider perspective, you mean, on neutrality? I think you mentioned with regards to the argument that is brought forth from Austrian stakeholders that they're involved a lot in peace-building operations in the Western Balkans. Was that what you were asking?
Yeah, the point on this is excuse of the provocate of neutrality in Austria for so-called no contribution to collective defense or so-called territorial defense.
Austria has been a good partner of NATO and has participated in a number of NATO operations, and that's very positive. But I'm afraid the problem with Austria is not with the military. The problem is on the political side and the economic side as well. And this falls over into the China issue as well. The dependence of Austria on trade with both Russia and China is at a level that I think is of pretty serious concern to those of us in the United States who look at those issues. And so I think that there just seem to be a lot of growing economic interests in Austria, in both China and Russia. And Austria has not been as cooperative in terms of the sanctions being imposed on Russia. And I think we see a growing problem with China because of China. China is being very cautious in how it supplies assistance to Russia, but it is doing it and providing very essential things. It's just not providing a lot of end products, but it is providing enough to be of great concern. And if Russia weren't getting that assistance from China, they would be in much worse condition in terms of fighting in Ukraine. I'm afraid I have to be just as negative on the OSCE, and I won't go into that, but OSCE was a great idea when you could hope for some cooperation from all of the countries in the OSCE. But with the condition that we have now, with Russia's attitude toward its role in the world, it tends to make the OSCE obsolete, as Alena suggested. I'm sorry to say that too, because that was something that way back in the origins of the OSCE that I had hopes for as being an important part of the future structure, but I never counted on it, which is a good thing, because unfortunately we now have a situation where it is not very relevant. The role of the UK in European defense, this is one reason why I am was so concerned about Brexit. Not only was Brexit something that the Russians obviously believed would weaken the West by the UK pulling out of the European Union, it also made it much more challenging to talk about future European defense cooperation. There is cooperation obviously going on between the French and the British and other governments, but it's made it much more complicated and much more difficult to imagine the very effective, thoroughgoing cooperation among European countries to build that European pillar that we need. It hopefully will still happen, and the British are a very important part of it, and I hope that the European Union will find ways to facilitate British cooperation, and now we're going to have probably a change of governments in London, so we'll find out a whole new set of circumstances that will govern that kind of cooperation. So it's another adding to the uncertain picture that we have about the future in that area. So, did I miss something?
I think the most important points were mentioned. Thank you so much. Let's have one more round of questions, starting again here from the second row, please, and then we can move back. Thank you so much for your questions.
Well, thank you very much for all the explanations, highly interesting. I have questions to Mr. Sloan. The one thing is, didn't the Biden administration underestimate this impact of the Trumpists, talking about the 61 billion US dollars, which were delayed so much that Ukraine is in serious trouble? And I wonder about Mike Johnson. What did he risk his political career, or do you think that Trump himself or some of the Trumpists sort of were ready to give in? I just wonder, and this may be indicating something for the future. When we remember back in 2016, people like Manafort, they were really pro-Russian, pro-Putin, or Flynn and other guys. So what can we expect from the Trumpists if Trump ever gets elected? The other thing about Austria, certainly one can criticize. We have a gas deal where we imported for 7 billion euros in 22, 5 billion I think last year. This is just incredible. It's also friendly politicians to Russia who were behind a little bit this contract. One really has to say that. Now I just wonder for the war economy, isn't it really becoming a danger then, because Russia is changing the war economy? Once you're in war economy and the more you are, and these are the signs now with the new defense minister, it's also difficult to get out. So even if there was some agreement with Ukraine finally, the war economy has started. And Pistorius, the Minister of Defense in Germany, weeks ago already said that Russia in some fields is already producing more than it needs for Ukraine. So finally, maybe also Trump may wake up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think there is another question here on my right. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Anna, and I'm a student here at the DA. I have a question for Ms. Kudzko. You mentioned earlier that the EU, in theory, has the capacity to defeat Russia. What exactly do you mean by defeating Russia? And also for Mr. Sloan, you mentioned that we should be worried here in the West by what Russia's doing in Ukraine. Do you honestly, realistically speaking, see Russia as powerful enough right now to seriously endanger our security here in the West? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And one more question here in the second row, the far left from my perspective.
Thank you. El Hari from Emirates News Agency, and I would like to ask about the impact the cooperation between Europe and the NATO and USA on the security in Middle East.
Thank you very much. Again, lots of interesting questions. Stanley, I'd like to ask you now to start with answering and addressing some of them, especially the ones that were directly addressed to you. Please.
Yeah, the question of Trump. I think a problem with Trump is that he's totally unpredictable. It's very hard to know exactly what he means. Sometimes I think he doesn't even know what he means himself. But his instincts are all pretty bad. And he's definitely a narcissist, and so everything is important to how it affects him personally. And he's someone who does not have a value set that we could recognize, and that's another problem on a whole lot of different levels. But what worries me is that he has basically said he understands that in his first administration, a lot of the officials that came in from the Republican Party acted as guardrails, the guardrails that kept him in an area that was somewhat more traditional than what he wanted. And he has said he's going to bring in people to the top positions of National Security Advisor, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, that will agree with him, that will start out agreeing with his objectives and perspectives. And when you look at the crowd of people around him that might fit that bill, it's very worrisome. So I'm not at all comfortable with any possibility for him becoming president, because I think we'll have a huge impact on foreign and defense policy. And a lot of the things that he has said somewhat wildly about relations with Europe and NATO could in fact be translated into real policies. So I think that there's real reason for concern. There also is another concern, and that's one that, at least without classified information, it's hard to prove. But there is a strong suspicion that he does feel not just an admiration for Putin, but he owes a debt to Putin. And that there's a lot of stuff that we don't know about, and you can trace some of it back to the Deutsche Bank loans that saved him at one point, and the fact that the money for that was coming from Russian sources. He knows where the money came from, and I think the Russians do hold something over him, and maybe some things that are quite influential. In any case, he being from the self-interest point of view, he understands all of that. And so I think if you put together his financial connections to Russian sources of money with his admiration for dictators, which seems to be quite clear, that's very worrisome. And the fact that he said he would end the war in Ukraine on his first 2 days in office, that's also worrisome, because it sort of indicates that he'd be willing to just cut a deal with Putin, which would, who knows what it would allow, but it certainly wouldn't benefit Ukraine. So I think all of those things are reason for concern. I don't see anything reassuring in foreign and defense policy about Trump.
Can you give us your 2 cents also on the question regarding the Middle East?
It's also, and some of the same factors apply in the Middle East, in that he's had, obviously, he and his family have benefited greatly from Saudi money and money from elsewhere in the Middle East. And I just think he's unpredictable, because he's likely to do whatever he thinks is going to benefit himself financially. And that means that U.S. interests or global interests are going to be of a second level in terms of the basis for his actions.
Yeah, thank you. Alena.
Very briefly, just comment on the war economy, that it might send us in a dangerous spiral that we won't be able to stop. Yes, it's dangerous, but the only other thing that's even more dangerous is for your opponent to have the war economy and for you not to have it. So of course there's a risk associated with that, and it might drag us into some kind of another arms race. But at the same time, it's very difficult to stop it unilaterally by simply giving up and not trying to engage in it. On the EU and what defeating Russia means, for me defeating Russia means that Russia needs to go back to its internationally recognized borders out of Ukraine, and for Ukraine to have a viable and secure state that can both flourish economically but also be able to defend against potential aggression. I do think technically it's possible. Technically, I mean, if Europeans and Americans want to prioritize it and channel the necessary resources into that, it can be done. The question is about how both sides perceive risks and whether there's enough common perception of the risk of what it would take to prioritize indeed victory of Ukraine, and whether Europeans and Americans, both sides, are ready to take these risks at this moment in time. I think, again, they should. I think the risk of not doing it is much bigger, but realistically, I don't think Europeans and Americans, as we can see at this moment right now.
I'd just like to make a very brief response to the question about whether Russia would be a threat after what is happening or what is taking out of Russia in Ukraine. And that's a great question, because there are people who think that going to a full-fledged war economy today will put Russia in very deep economic trouble in a couple of years, that they won't be able to sustain the kind of level of activity, and therefore their military will not be as threatening as it has been in the past. And I think there's some truth to that, and that in fact the likelihood of their making some major attack on the West, and certainly not on Austria, but on the West in general, is diminished in some ways. But on the other hand, the Russians have found a lot of ways to influence affairs in other countries. They have the most incredibly active spy network, and very active, working their way into political systems, including the one here in Austria, and influencing elections elsewhere. So even if they aren't a threat to directly invade NATO countries, they still could be a threat to neighboring countries. And I don't see, Finland I don't think is threatened, because Finland's demonstrated they can defend themselves against the Russians very effectively. But there are other countries, the Baltic states, I think, remain very concerned, and they are more vulnerable. And depends on the outcome in Ukraine as well. If Russia is allowed to defeat Ukraine and takes control of a big chunk of Ukraine or all of it, then I think other countries in the neighborhood should be very concerned. And I don't think that China is going to allow Russia to go under completely. And so Russia will get help from China that will help Russia survive the economic weakness that it may experience as a result of what they've put into the war against Ukraine. There are a lot of uncertainties in that picture, but it's a good question. It's one that we have to keep our eyes on, is what is actually happening to Russia as a threat to the West. And we shouldn't forget the nuclear threat, that Russia will maintain that capability, whether it has conventional threats that could allow it to attack the West. It could have the ability. We've already seen how Putin has, I think, imposed more caution on Western countries, including the United States, by the threat of using nuclear weapons, and they will still have nuclear weapons no matter what happens in Ukraine. Good question, though.
As final remarks, I have one very last question for both of you, one very direct question. Of course, we said we cannot foresee the outcome of neither the US elections nor the European Parliament elections. Our crystal balls don't work here. But if you would have one recommendation each for Stan, in your case, the new US administration, no matter which administration we'll have in the future, one recommendation to the new president, what would that be?
To the new president? Well, it's one that would be totally ignored by Donald Trump and can be a continuity with President Biden, and that is that no matter what, the United States is stronger in a good alliance relationship with Europe. And even if China is increasing as an important threat to the interests of the West, the fact is that the United States will always be stronger with European allies, and the European allies will always be stronger with the United States. And I think that even as we have all kinds of problems with each other and disagreements, the fact is that we're going to be stronger together. And if I were asked by a Trump presidency, I would give them that same answer. My experience in the Congressional Research Service was, if you're asked a question by a Republican or a Democrat, you give them both the same answer. So that's what I would do.
Wonderful. And in very little time, in approximately 2 weeks, we have European Parliament elections. Everyone here who is a European citizen, definitely please make sure of that ability to cast your vote. But for you, Alena, for the new European Parliament, one recommendation, what would that be?
Yeah, it's a very broad one. We need to do everything we can to make sure that European is economically, technologically, and militarily competitive. It's a very broad package of things that go onto that, but why I'm saying that? Even going back to the relations with the United States, but with all other countries, and what Professor Sloan called the existence of Europe, we need to make sure that we exist for our partners as an interesting value proposition. We need to make sure that we bring something on the table that others want. It can be military capabilities, it can be technological capabilities, it can be vibrant economy. And sadly, we're a little bit behind, to put it mildly, on all of the 3 criteria, so that would be my first emphasis for the new EU Commission and Parliament.
Great. Great recommendations. I hope that the new political stakeholders in the US and in Europe will take those seriously. Thanks to the audience for participating proactively and answering and asking very relevant questions. Thank you, Stanley Sloan. Thank you, Alena Kudzko, for your excellent remarks. Please join me in giving a big hand to our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Michael.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I wish you a wonderful evening, and stay tuned for our upcoming events and discussions also on this Transatlantic Talk series. Thank you very much.
It was fun.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, I have full respect.
Thank you.